Greetings programs. On one of my most recent guides, I feel I recommended a variation of a build that not only favors higher Paragon players, but also one that is harder to acquire and play. I will seek to amend this misstep by re-releasing this guide. This particular build is amazing fun, quick clearing, a great option for solo gym leveling, boasting 2 to 4 minute clear times, capability to become invulnerable to damage, and quite a bit of eye candy to boot. I give you the Dead Cold Invigoration Corpse Explosion Speed Necromancer. This build has so much to offer. One of the cooler interactions here that we're going to be leveraging is the Captain Crimson's set bonus. You'll see here that part of this bonus is damage taken is reduced by your percentage of resource cost reduction. Well, what happens when you slot Land of the Dead Invigoration on your skill bar is you actually go invulnerable. You're immune to damage when this is active and you're wearing Captain Crimson's bonus, because what this is doing is giving you 100% resource cost reduction, 100% damage reduction, therefore you are immune. So the entire idea behind this build is to stack higher cooldown reducing items and abilities to get us as close as we can to 100% uptime on Land of the Dead, so that we will not die within the rift, plus be able to cast our Corpse Explosion at will. Yes, this is a Corpse Explosion build. This is our main damage dealer. Even though you will see a lot of lances going off, Corpse Lances, these are going to be procced from the 2-piece, and those are also very important for this build. Corpse Explosion will be the main damage dealer. Now, the cool thing here is that we are running the Cold Rune, the Dead Cold Rune, on Corpse Explosion to freeze enemies and proc our Crispin's sentence bonus, our triple damage bonus from this item. The multiplier there being activated from the rune itself, rather than running Land of the Dead Frozen Lands, which most builds will, to proc the freeze effect. We're going Invigoration here to get that immunity, right? So we need something to proc Crispin. We're running the Jesseth's Arms set here, giving us that 400% increased damage, 5 times multiplier, while our skeletons are commanded on a target. This is going to be very important throughout the rift, making sure that this bonus is active. Command skeletons on the bar, of course. We are running in the cube the Messerschmitt's Reaver, reducing the remaining cooldown of one of our skills by 1 second when we kill enemies. This is really important for both mobility and maintaining Land of the Dead uptime. So more dense areas of the rift, this will proc more. Less dense areas of the rift, your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac will come into the play. This item in particular, helping to reduce the remaining cooldown of our skills when we hit with a resource spending attack. And since Command Skeletons counts as a resource spending attack, it will proc every time you cast on an enemy. Now it only procs once, it's not going to as your skeletons are continue to be commanded, they will not automatically reproc this item. It's just once upon cast, but since we're hovering over enemies throughout the rift, this will proc fairly often, especially when you're attacking single targets, such as the Rift Guardian. Now it's very tempting to actually just go ahead and spam your Corpse Explosion in general areas, but you want to actually be hovering over enemies with your cursor with this build. That's because we're going to put our Command Skeletons and our Devour on Autocast, Numlock, whatever you're using, to make sure that these will be cast at all times. You're going to want to probably manually cast and maintain your Land of the Dead. This is because rift level transitions can be kind of tricky. If you're nearing the end of a rift level, you definitely want to withhold recasting your Land of the Dead if possible. This is because you don't want to spend a lot of time at the end of that level and the beginning of the next level, where typically there aren't a lot of enemies nearby with your Land of the Dead active. If you engage an elite pack at the very beginning of your rift, the first rift level that you enter, you want to skip that elite pack as well, because you're especially for during your first rotation here, we won't have the Gogok of Swiftness cooldown from this item active during that first Land of the Dead rotation, so you're going to need to proc your Messerschmitt's Reaver all that more often in that first rotation. You want to be targeting small trash mobs, quick kills. You want to be getting those resets on your Land of the Dead, right? Juggernauts are pretty much almost unkillable. With this build, you want to skip them about 90% of the time. Another cooldown reducing ability is Blood is Power. This passive gives you 20% reduced cooldowns for your Land of the Dead after cumulatively losing 100% of your maximum life. So there's not a lot of ways, aside from getting hit outside of Land of the Dead, that this build could fit in self-damage. So it turns out, though, a really cool interaction here is the Blood Rush rune Metabolism. We're actually opting for the double charges here, not only to be able to traverse through the rift quicker, but also to deal more damage to ourselves, and therefore more consistently proc the Blood is Power rune. I find typically that closer into the end of when my Land of the Dead is getting reset is when I've come to the point where I've cast Blood Rush enough that it will actually proc Blood is Power and then finally reset this to full. So this is sort of like a safeguard that if you haven't killed enough enemies with your Messerschmitt's Reaver, or you haven't been focusing on targets enough with your Zodiac, the Blood is Power will kick in and reset that last bit of Land of the Dead cooldown for you. It's actually quite nice to have on the build. We are running the Command Skeleton's Dark Mending, and this is for recovery. The higher attack speed that we're running will let them attack quite often, letting us regenerate our health, especially with spending so much of your health through the metabolism room. You're going to need some mechanism to help you recover that health, even though we are immune, right? So this is how we're going to do it, and because we're commanding quite often, this will be up the majority of the rift as well. The Squirt's Necklace, giving us this increased damage multiplier, 2 times damage, while we are not getting hit. Well, since we're invulnerable, we are immune to damage while Land of the Dead is up. This will be up most of the rift, and indeed, in optimal scenarios, this is just an amazing item to place in the build. Other damage multipliers include the Captain Crimson's, of course, super high cooldown on gear with this build, almost every slot you can fit it in on, so the multiplier from this set also going to be increasing our Corpse Explosion damage quite a bit. Other more passive damage multipliers include the Grasps of Essence and the Cube, giving us that stacking 200% up to 1000%. And then we also have the Pestilence 6-piece, giving us that 3300% for Corpse Explosion and Corpse Lance. Again, we're mostly using the Corpse Explosion damage increase here. Even though we have Lance on the bar, Corpse Explosion is our main damage dealer. We also have the 4-piece giving us damage reduction as well, so that's notable for when we get stuck outside of Land of the Dead. Bane of the Trapped giving us that increased damage to enemies that we're going to be freezing, of course, with our main damaging attack. This will always be active, pretty much. And then we also have the Zeiss Stone of Vengeance. This is the better choice over Bane of the Powerful for this particular build, because you want to be, especially on those healthy single targets, such as like Elite Packs, Yellows, Rift Guardians, you want to be able to leverage the increased damage from attacking at range, especially, and this is one of the better ways to be able to scale up your damage to enemies in certain scenarios. We're also running an Oculus ring on our follower, creating that focused ring of power, and since we do have Blood Rush in this build and a lot of charges to have that available, it's super easy to just Blood Rush into an Oculus ring when it spawns and then attack an Elite Pack or other healthy targets. Another way we are scaling the damage with this build is actually placing Corpse Lance on the bar. We're running the Brittle Touch rune, which increases the chance for enemies to be crit each time they're hit with Corpse Lance. This is very important because we are running the 2-piece Pestilence, of course, when we consume corpses, we will auto-fire lances at enemies and they will assume the Brittle Touch rune. This debuff will be amazing not only for scaling up the damage within the Rift, especially against those healthier targets, elites, the Rift Guardian, that sort of thing, but also for gearing. It's just really nice to be able to drop crit hit chance on some of our items and not have to roll that affix, right? So we're invulnerable most of the Rift, but how are we surviving outside of Land of the Dead? In those situations where we get caught with our cooldown not active, caught with our pants down, if you will, we're actually going to be using Devour Voracious. So this seems counterintuitive, but this is the best rune I've found. It kind of gives you a stay of execution, where this rune gives you up to 25 stacks at 2% apiece. That gives you 50%. So it's giving you 50% damage reduction from this one rune, and it lasts a duration of 5 seconds. And this is very important because it gives you all that much more time to proc your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac and try and proc your Blood is Power bonus outside of Land of the Dead to reset that cooldown before basically getting overwhelmed by damage, right? What doesn't have a longer duration is your Gogok of Swiftness. So this is more in line with that 4 to 5 second duration, giving us dodge, obviously, for defensively, but more importantly, this will give us extra cooldown and attack speed, so it's kind of nice to have this up when our Land of the Dead is cast. It's also going to be very important for hitting a particular attack speed that I will cover later. Of note, the interaction with your Pestilence 2-piece, spitting out lances, will proc your Gogok of Swiftness and refresh this bonus. So you kind of get delays near the end of your Land of the Dead rotation, which will spit out 1 or 2 extra corpses that you've happened to kill. So actually, even though this is 4 seconds, it really ends up being closer to 5 seconds of remaining duration. Lines up quite nicely with your Voracious duration there, right? Corpse Explosion damage instances only occur once every 9 frames. Now that being said, attack speed will allow you to begin with successive casts of Corpse Explosion to overlap those damage instances. So the higher and higher you get, the closer your Corpse Explosion casts are, the more interwoven your damage instance explosions will become. So it becomes really important for those longer DPS scenarios against elites in the Rift Guardian, and also for retargeting, because you're going to want to reposition your Corpse Explosion damage area quite often, I would imagine. So it becomes more fluid, especially when you're doing that sort of stutter stepping kiting thing, kind of creeping up into the density, especially with the Zaya's bonus in play. Another passive that's going to let you just give you that extra layer of being able to continue your cycle without perishing in the Rift is going to be Final Service, giving you that second life passive, that second chance at, you know, continuing on, tangoing on, if we will, throughout the Rift. So something you will notice is I'm actually running Rathma's shield here, and you think this is rather redundant, running an passive that gives you immunity to damage when we're already immune to damage, but there's a little bit of a weird interaction here with the Land of the Dead Invigoration and the Captain Crimsons. While it makes you immune to damage, there are certain damage effects, damage over time effects in particular, poisons, bleeds, fire, immolation type effects, that if you are affected by these damage over time instances when you activate your Land of the Dead, you will continue to have that damage dealt to you. And we are so flimsy toughness wise in this build because we're banking on the fact that we're going to have that immunity available, that we will often die rather quickly to these damage over time effects. And what this does is it actually stops us from losing life immediately when we press Land of the Dead. So even if we're affected by these damage over time instances, they will not kill us when we hit that Land of the Dead bonus. It's actually saved my life quite often, and I highly recommend it. Another passive that you could use, at lower Paragon especially, is Standalone, giving us that increased armor bonus. Even though you have 7 Skeletal Warriors here, reducing this bonus only to 30% armor. It's still about a 17% toughness increase, which is notable, especially for lower paragons. So I would recommend either one of these passes, but I've been preferring Rathma's shield. For mobility, we are running Fueled by Death, giving us that 30% extra movement speed. Very important for being able to scoop up orbs, being able to, just move around in between your blood rushes a little bit easier, kind of stutter stuff, because oftentimes you're doing this sort of thing while you're moving through the rift, trying to get better angles with your corpse explosion. So another version of the build that you can opt to run is actually going for the Flavor of Time. And this variation is a little bit harder to play because we're dropping the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. So you lose that potential to reset cooldowns, especially on less dense rifts. It will become more apparent that it's a little bit more challenging to keep up your Land of the Dead. However, the fact that your pylons are going to be doubled counteracts this to some degree, and I quite enjoy this variation. Being able to get a power pylon or a conduit pylon or a channeling pylon or even a shield pylon early in the rift can be hugely beneficial. That said, if you don't get any one of these earlier in the rift, it can feel a little bit less beneficial. That said, this version produced the quickest clears out of any version I played. So just keep that in mind when you get those higher paragons and are able to perfect those cooldown affixes. Maybe roll a more perfected Ring of Royal Grandeur from Act 1 bounties or re-rolling in the cube. Then you can try this one out as well and see how you like it. And now for affixes. Getting into this build is a little bit easier than you would think because we have such a nice time having so many cooldown reducing items in the build. You can actually get started with quite a low amount of cooldown. That said, you need to shoot for cooldown pieces on gear. The first affix you should opt for in a season is cooldown on every piece, even over crit, even over crit hit damage. So if you have to give up crit hit damage, that's fine. Especially giving up crit is a little bit more favorable because, again, we are running Brittle Touch on our bar. So just keep in mind, like the gloves, the shield, if you have to give up those crit affixes, that is perfectly fine in favor of gearing for cooldown. Now, earlier in season, I am going to prefer running the cooldown affix on the necklace as well. So every piece, the diamond and the helm, shoulder, gloves, both rings, the shield, the weapon, and then the paragon and the amulet now as well. This is because typically earlier in season you won't have perfected cooldown affixes, so you might have 6%, you might have 5%, you might have 8% here and there, so just having that extra affix on the amulet seems to work out better earlier in season. Now when you start to get better and better pieces of gear and those become more perfected, you will then be able to eventually drop the affix on your necklace and run something like this with the extra intelligence affix on the amulet, for example, is quite nice to have instead, because you finally have gotten those 8% pieces in place. Also notable here is the weapon. So earlier in season I would recommend going for that int affix on your weapon just to give you that higher base level of all resistance, and also it's a larger portion of damage at that point, so that's the better option. If later in season you can find one, getting damage percent there would be the better option to min-max, but int is still a great option even at these higher paragons, right? So attack speed and cooldown, of course, going to be the preferred affixes on a weapon, so you're going to, priority order wise, those are going to be the things you favor first, right? A very important affix for this particular build is going to be the secondary pickup radius that you can get on gear. Anything over +10, in my opinion, is a good amount to have. This is a very good amount to be able to scoop up those orbs. More importantly, what this is functioning as is it's saving your time on Land of the Dead. It's preserving that progression that you're getting in the rift, because oftentimes if you had lower pickup radius, you would be put in a situation where you'd have to choose between scooping up extra progression orbs from elite kills, or leaving them on the ground and continuing on the rift and preserving your Land of the Dead bonus. And it sometimes does come down to that. So pickup radius is very important. Try to get it in almost every place possible. I actually recommend going for control and pairing reduction here because you're more likely to get frozen by the frozen affix. In between those Land of the Dead cycles, you're more likely to get stunned and crowd controlled. So just having that little bit of extra CC reduction there is also quite nice. Secondary resists, of course, very important as well. Defensively, going vitality, life percent on belt, armor on the, pants, very important to have. Boots is also vitality on the helmet, very important. One of the only places you can fit it in. Vitality on the bracer as well, of course. And the shield. So attack speed, we're going to want to favor one of two attack speeds. I'm going to recommend either 1.97522 or 1.87785. And you have to hit these attack speeds fairly exactly if you want to benefit precisely from what my testing shows. My testing showed that 1.7785 was at 32 frames per attack intervals, steady, which is quite nice to always be assured that you're going to be at that interval. And then the 1.97522, and even lower 30 frames per attack intervals, so you can benefit even more when you stack that level. But notably, the 1.97522 does come with what I call a slightly increased keyframe interval, which is like a 36 FPA initial attack that you have to deal with when you start casting a Corpse Explosion in succession. So multiple casts of Corpse Explosion will settle into that nice 30 FPA interval cadence that you're going to be looking for. What this means is when you're attacking like elites or the Rift Guardian, you'll benefit from this quite nicely, and it just feels a little bit more fluid to be at this higher attack speed and actually benefit from the attack speed on your rings. To make use of that is quite nice because Charisma Instance, of course, rolling default attack speed, same deal here with the Zodiac. You can't really benefit from the RCR anyway, so just hitting this higher amount seems to be preferable in my opinion. So something you can do if your attack speeds are not perfect, for example, if your attack speeds on the rings especially don't roll perfectly, you can use this sort of ring, this sort of Crispins, for example, in this build. You just have to either adjust your Paragon. If you have, say, 6% rolls, you would adjust your Paragon down a little bit more. But if you have 5%ers, you keep the Enchantress, and you can run full attack speed on, with 5%ers on both your weapons, and you hit this lower value that I mentioned. If your weapon is not perfected, that's a little bit more damaging in my opinion, because you're kind of in between the good attack speeds that I've mentioned. But you can do something where you just slap on as much attack speed as possible. Try to get your attack speed as high as possible, because generally, as your attack speed increases, the interval of your Corpse Explosion cast will decrease. That's just the general trend, and I would say favor that over removing that attack speed in that case, just because that's the best you can do, right? And that'll about do it for this guide. I really hope you've made use of the information here. Super fun build for, just cheesing those, molten explosions, those grotesques, standing around, lounging around in Arcane, for a brief second or two. But yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with this build. Gearing up those gems, getting those greater of 90 plus rifts in, just solo especially, super cool build to run. Anyways, thank you for watching.